Here's something that reveals a fundamental truth about how wealth is built. The wealthy use debt strategically to build wealth faster. The poor avoid debt at all costs and stay poor longer. Most people think avoiding debt is financial wisdom. But that's only true for high-interest debt, credit cards at 20%, car loans at 8%, low-interest debt, student loans at 4%, mortgages at 3% to 4%. That's not something to avoid. That's something to arbitrage. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They borrow at low rates and invest at high rates. They leverage debt to accelerate wealth accumulation. But we tell college graduates to do the opposite. We tell them to pay off their lowest interest debt first while missing years of compound growth in the market. That's not wisdom. That's financial self-sabotage. Before we go deeper, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you contradicts the most popular financial advice in America. It contradicts what Dave Ramsey says. It contradicts what your parents probably told you. And if it makes you uncomfortable, if it challenges deeply held beliefs about debt being inherently evil, that discomfort means you need to hear this. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. Because this conversation is going to fundamentally change how you think about debt, leverage, and wealth building. I'm Larry Fink. I've been managing money since 1976, when I showed up on Wall Street wearing the world's ugliest brown suit and turquoise jewelry, looking ridiculous but hungry to understand how money and leverage actually work. Today, I run BlackRock, the largest asset management firm in the world, managing over $11 trillion for institutions and individuals who understand how to use capital efficiently. And in nearly 50 years of doing this work, I've seen a pattern that most people completely misunderstand. The pattern is this. Wealthy people use debt strategically to build wealth faster. Everyone else either avoids debt completely, which limits their wealth-building potential, or uses debt destructively for consumption, which destroys their financial future. But almost nobody uses debt the way the wealthy do. As a tool, as leverage, as arbitrage, as a way to access capital at low cost and deploy it at high returns. That's what separates people who build significant wealth from people who struggle financially despite good incomes and good intentions. Let me show you what I mean with some math that should fundamentally change how you think about debt. Let's say you're 25 years old. You just graduated college. You have $40,000 in student loans at 4% interest. You're earning $60,000 per year. You have a choice. Choice A. The conventional wisdom. Pay off the student loans as fast as possible. Put every extra dollar toward eliminating debt. Live frugally. Make sacrifices. Get out of debt before you start investing. Let's say you put $12,000 per year toward the loans, beyond the minimum payment. You pay them off in about 4 years. Then, at age 29, you start investing that $12,000 per year in the stock market. You do this until age 65, 36 years of investing. At 10% annual returns, that $12,000 per year for 36 years becomes about $4.2 million. Choice B. The wealthy person's approach. Make only the minimum payment on the student loans, about $5,000 per year. Invest the difference, $7,000 per year, starting immediately. Let the loans run their full term, gradually paying them off over time. You're investing $7,000 per year for 40 years, from age 25 to 65. At 10% returns, that becomes about $3.4 million. But you're also still paying the student loans. Over 10 years, you pay about $50,000 total, $40,000 principal plus $10,000 interest. So in choice B, you end up with about $3.35 million after accounting for the loan payments. Wait, you say? Choice A gave you $4.2 million. Choice B gave you $3.35 million. Doesn't that mean paying off debt fast is better? Not so fast. Let's look at what actually happened year by year. In choice A, for the first 4 years, you're putting $12,000 per year toward debt and nothing toward investments. In choice B, you're putting $7,000 per year toward investments and $5,000 toward debt. After 4 years in choice A, you have 0 debt and 0 investments. After 4 years in choice B, you have about $30,000 in investments and $25,000 remaining in debt. But here's the critical part. Once you pay off the debt in choice A, you start investing $12,000 per year. In choice B, you continue investing $7,000 per year. So in choice A, you're investing more annually once the debt is gone. The question is, does the delayed start overcome the lower annual contribution? Let's recalculate choice A more carefully. 4 years of no investing, then 36 years of $12,000 per year at 10% returns equals $4.2 million. That's correct. But wait. In choice B, after 10 years when the loan is paid off, you can increase your investment to $12,000 per year too. For the first 10 years, you invest $7,000. For the next 30 years, you invest $12,000. $7,000 per year for 10 years at 10% becomes about $122,000 at year 10. Then that $122,000 compounds for another 30 years while you add $12,000 per year. The final amount is about $4.7 million. Choice A, $4.2 million. Choice B, $4.7 million. By starting earlier, even with lower contributions, you end up with $500,000 more. That's the power of time in the market. That's what you're giving up by rushing to pay off low-interest debt instead of arbitraging it. And this is a conservative example. I assumed the same investment amount eventually. But in reality, if you're psychologically comfortable carrying manageable debt, you might invest even more aggressively because you're not driven by debt aversion. Now, let me show you an even more dramatic example. Mortgages. Let's say you're 30 years old, buying a house. You have $200,000 saved. The house costs $500,000. You have two choices. Choice A. Put down $200,000, borrow $300,000 at 4% for 30 years. Your mortgage payment is about $1,432 per month, $17,200 per year. Choice B. Put down $50,000, borrow $450,000 at 4% for 30 years. Your mortgage payment is about $2,148 per month, $25,800 per year. But you still have $150,000 to invest immediately. In choice A, you have lower debt, lower payments. Over 30 years, you'll pay about $216,000 in interest. In choice B, you have higher debt, higher payments. Over 30 years, you'll pay about $323,000 in interest. Choice B costs you an extra $107,000 in interest. But what happens to that $150,000 you didn't put down in choice B? You invest it. At 8% returns over 30 years, that $150,000 becomes $1.5 million. You paid an extra $107,000 in mortgage interest. But you gained $1.35 million in investment returns. Net benefit. About $1.24 million. That's debt arbitrage. Borrowing at 4%, investing at 8%, and keeping the spread. That's how the wealthy use leverage to accelerate wealth building. But here's what most people do. They put down as much as possible to minimize debt. They feel better having less debt. It feels safer. It feels more responsible. But it's actually costing them over $1 million in this scenario. Now, I can already hear the objections. But Larry, what if the market crashes? What if I lose my job? What if I can't make the payments? Isn't carrying more debt riskier? Let me address this directly because this is where people's emotional relationship with debt overrides their rational analysis of risk. Yes, carrying more debt means higher fixed obligations. If you lose your income, higher debt payments are harder to cover. That's true, but let's think about the actual risk profile. In choice A with the lower mortgage, you have lower payments, but you also have less liquidity. Your money is locked in home equity. If you lose your job, you can't access that equity without taking out a loan or selling the house. In choice B with the higher mortgage, you have higher payments, but you also have $1.5 million in liquid investments by the time you're 60. If you lose your job at 55, you have a massive cushion. You can cover your mortgage payments for years from your investment portfolio. The risk doesn't go away in choice A, it just shifts. Instead of being vulnerable to job loss because of high fixed payments, you're vulnerable to job loss because of low liquidity. And historically, liquidity is more valuable than equity during financial emergencies. At BlackRock, when we evaluate risk for institutional clients, we don't just look at debt levels. We look at liquidity, asset diversification, cash flow coverage. And often, institutions with higher strategic debt but high liquidity are less risky than institutions with low debt but low liquidity. The same principle applies to individuals. Strategic debt with high liquidity can be less risky than no debt with low liquidity. But most people don't think this way because they've been conditioned to view all debt as inherently dangerous. Here's the fundamental misunderstanding. Debt is not intrinsically good or bad. Debt is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used productively or destructively. Destructive debt, High-interest debt used for consumption. Credit cards at 20% used to buy clothes, electronics, vacations. Car loans at 8% for vehicles you can't afford. This is debt that costs more in interest than you could reasonably earn investing. This is debt that finances consumption that provides no lasting value. This debt destroys wealth. Avoid it completely. Strategic debt. Low-interest debt that costs less than the expected return on invested capital. Mortgages at 3% to 4%. Student loans at 3% to 5% for degrees that increase earning power. Business loans at 5% to 6% that finance growth. This is debt where you're borrowing at X% and deploying the capital at Y%, where Y is substantially larger than X. This debt accelerates wealth building when used correctly. The wealthy understand this distinction instinctively. They avoid destructive debt and embrace strategic debt. Everyone else lumps all debt together and tries to avoid it, missing the opportunity to leverage capital and accelerate wealth. Let me tell you about someone I know. Graduated with $80,000 in student loans at 4.5% interest. This is a high amount, but for a degree that led to a $100,000 starting salary. Conventional wisdom said pay off the loans quickly. Minimum payment was about $830 per month, $10,000 per year. Instead of paying extra on the loans, they paid the minimum and invested every other dollar they could save. Over 10 years, they invested about $30,000 per year while making loan payments. At 10% returns, after 10 years, they had about $525,000 in investments. The student loans were fully paid off on schedule. If they'd followed conventional wisdom and put an extra $20,000 per year toward the loans, paying them off in about 4 years, then started investing $30,000 per year for the remaining 6 years, they'd have about $245,000 at year 10. Same 10-year period, same income, different strategy. The result, $525,000 versus $245,000. More than double the wealth by using strategic debt instead of rushing to pay it off. Now, here's what makes this conversation difficult. The financial advice industry is split between two camps. One camp, the debt-averse camp, says all debt is bad, pay it off as fast as possible, live debt-free. This appeals to people's emotional fear of debt. It's simple, it's intuitive, and it's wrong for anyone who has access to low-interest debt and can invest the alternative capital at higher returns. The other camp, the leverage-aggressive camp, says use as much debt as possible to maximize returns. This appeals to people's desire to get rich fast. It's exciting, it's aspirational, and it's dangerous if you don't understand risk management. What I'm giving you is neither extreme. I'm not saying all debt is good. I'm not saying avoid all debt. I'm saying, understand the cost of debt, understand the expected return on invested capital, and arbitrage the spread when the math makes sense and the risk is manageable. That's sophisticated financial thinking. That's how institutions think. That's how wealthy individuals think. But it's not how popular financial advice works because it requires nuance, and nuance doesn't sell books or get viral social media posts. At BlackRock, we use leverage constantly in portfolio management. Not recklessly, but strategically. When we can borrow at low rates and deploy capital at higher expected returns, we do it. That's how we generate alpha for clients. That's how we've grown to manage $11 trillion. Individual wealth building works the same way. If you can borrow at 4% and invest at 8% to 10%, you should borrow, assuming you can manage the risk and maintain liquidity. If you're borrowing at 20% for consumption, you're destroying wealth and you should stop immediately. The problem is, most financial education doesn't make this distinction. It treats debt as a monolithic evil or a monolithic good. And neither extreme is correct. The correct approach is contextual, mathematical, risk-adjusted. Strategic debt is good when the arbitrage is positive and the risk is managed. Destructive debt is bad always. Over the next sections, we're going to break this down systematically. We're going to talk about exactly when debt arbitrage makes sense and when it doesn't. We're going to talk about risk management, about how to use leverage without overextending. We're going to talk about the psychological barriers that prevent people from thinking clearly about debt. And we're going to talk about how to build wealth faster by leveraging low-cost debt instead of avoiding it. Because here's what I've learned in 50 years. The people who build significant wealth, they're not debt-free. They're strategically leveraged. They understand that capital has a cost, that time has value, and that arbitraging the spread between borrowing costs and investment returns is one of the most powerful wealth-building tools available. Most people don't understand this. They follow simple rules about avoiding debt, and they miss out on hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars in wealth that could have been theirs if they'd thought more strategically about leverage. That doesn't have to be you. But it won't be you only if you're willing to challenge conventional wisdom about debt, think like an institution thinks about leverage, and run the actual math for your specific situation rather than following one-size-fits-all rules. Let's begin. Let me give you the precise framework for deciding when to use debt strategically and when to avoid it. Because this isn't about borrowing as much as possible or avoiding all debt. It's about understanding the mathematics of arbitrage and the psychology of risk. The framework is built on three variables: the cost of debt, the expected return on invested capital, and your personal risk capacity. When the math works and the risk is manageable, leverage accelerates wealth. When either condition fails, leverage destroys wealth. Let's start with the math. The fundamental question is, can you reliably earn more investing the money than the debt costs you? If you have a mortgage at 3.5% and you can invest in a diversified portfolio expected to return 9% to 10% over time, the spread is 5.5% to 6.5%. That's positive arbitrage. Over decades, that spread compounds into substantial wealth. You should carry the mortgage and invest the alternative capital. If you have credit card debt at 20% and you're investing in stocks at 10%, the spread is negative 10%. You're losing money. You cannot arbitrage a negative spread. You should pay off the credit card immediately, even if it means selling investments to do it. This sounds obvious, but most people don't think this way. They think about debt emotionally. I hate having debt. I want to be debt-free. That emotional response leads them to pay off 4% student loans while missing years of 10% market returns. They're arbitraging negatively because of psychology, not mathematics. At BlackRock, when we use leverage for clients, we don't ask, how do we feel about debt? We ask, what's the cost of capital? What's the expected return? What's the spread? And what's the risk-adjusted benefit? We're completely dispassionate. We're mathematically rigorous. Individual investors need to think the same way. Now, let me break down specific scenarios so you can apply this framework to your situation. Scenario 1. Student loans at 3% to 5% interest. You're young, you have decades until retirement, you have stable income. The math. Student loan interest is 3% to 5%. Historical stock market returns are about 10% average with significant volatility. The expected spread is 5% to 7%. The decision. Make minimum payments on the student loans. Invest every other dollar in diversified index funds. Over 30 to 40 years, the compound return on the invested capital will dramatically exceed the interest cost on the loans. You'll build substantially more wealth than if you rushed to pay off the loans. The exception. If you're extremely debt-averse psychologically and the debt is causing you significant stress that affects your quality of life, pay it off even if the math says not to. Mental health has value, but understand you're making an emotional choice that costs you wealth. Scenario 2. Mortgage at 3% to 4% interest. You're buying a house. You have cash that could go toward a larger down payment or toward investments. The math. Mortgage interest is 3% to 4%, often tax deductible if you itemize. Investment returns are 8% to 10% expected. The spread is 4% to 7%. The decision. Make a moderate down payment, 10% to 20%, enough to avoid PMI and to have reasonable payments you can comfortably afford. Invest the rest. Do not put down 50% or 100% even if you could. That's locking capital in an illiquid asset at a low effective return when it could be compounding at much higher rates in liquid investments. The exception. If you're close to retirement, within 10 years, and you want the psychological security of a paid-off house, it's reasonable to prioritize paying off the mortgage even if the math says to invest. The value of guaranteed housing costs in retirement can outweigh the opportunity cost. Scenario 3. Car loans at 6% to 8% interest. You need a vehicle. The math. Car loan interest is 6% to 8%, and the car itself is a depreciating asset. You're paying interest to own something that's losing value. The expected spread compared to investing is 2% to 4%, much smaller than mortgages or student loans. The decision. This is borderline. If the rate is 5% or below, you could justify keeping the loan and investing the alternative capital. If it's above 6%, I'd lean toward paying off the loan faster. And critically, buy less car. The biggest mistake isn't the loan interest rate. It's financing too much car in the first place. The exception. If you can get 0% to 2% financing, which sometimes happens on new cars, take it. Absolutely take it. That's free money. You're borrowing at 0% to 2% and can invest at 8% to 10%. That's exceptional arbitrage. Scenario 4. Credit card debt at 15% to 25% interest. The math. There is no math. There's no investment that reliably returns 15% to 25% with the certainty required to justify this spread. This debt is destructive, not strategic. The decision. Pay it off immediately. Sell investments if you need to. Cut consumption dramatically. Get rid of it. This is an emergency. Once it's gone, never carry a credit card balance again. Use credit cards for convenience and rewards, but pay them off in full every month. No exceptions. This is not strategic debt. This is financial destruction. There is no scenario where carrying high-interest consumer debt makes sense. Now, let me talk about risk management. Because the math of arbitrage is only half the picture. The other half is understanding and managing the risk of leverage. Risk number 1. Income volatility. If you lose your job or your income drops significantly, high debt payments become a crisis. How to manage it? Maintain high liquidity. If you're carrying strategic debt, you should also have substantial liquid investments. At minimum, 6 to 12 months of expenses in cash or easily accessible investments. Ideally, much more. The point of strategic debt is to keep capital liquid and invested, so by definition, you should have liquidity to cover emergencies. Risk number 2. Market volatility. If you borrow to invest and the market crashes, you're still paying debt service on investments that have dropped in value. How to manage it? Invest for the long term. Don't borrow to invest if you might need the money in 5 years. The strategy of debt arbitrage works over 20, 30, 40-year horizons where market volatility averages out. It doesn't work over short horizons where you might be forced to sell at the bottom. Risk number 3. Rising interest rates. If you have variable rate debt and rates increase, your spread decreases or becomes negative. How to manage it? Prefer fixed rate debt for long-term strategic leverage. Lock in low rates. If you must use variable rate debt, factor in rate risk. Assume rates could increase by 2% to 3% and ensure the spread is still positive in that scenario. Risk number 4. Psychological stress. Leverage increases both upside and downside volatility. Some people can't tolerate this psychologically. How to manage it? Know yourself. If carrying debt causes you anxiety that affects your sleep, your health, your relationships, don't do it. Or do it in small amounts. Start with one strategic debt, see how you handle it psychologically, then scale if you're comfortable. At BlackRock, we manage risk through diversification, liquidity management, stress testing, and position sizing. Individual investors should do the same. Don't lever up to the maximum mathematically possible. Lever up to a level where you can handle adverse scenarios without panic. A good rule. Your debt service should not exceed 30% of gross income. Preferably less. And you should have liquid assets equal to at least 2 years of debt payments. This ensures you can weather job loss or market downturns without being forced into destructive decisions. Now let me address the psychological barriers that prevent people from thinking clearly about strategic debt. Barrier 1. Debt is emotionally coded as dangerous, shameful, or irresponsible. This emotional response comes from 2 sources. First, cultural and religious traditions that view debt as moral failing or servitude. Second, personal or family experiences with destructive debt, credit cards, payday loans, bankruptcy. These associations make people avoid all debt, even when the math says leverage is beneficial. They're conflating strategic low-interest debt with destructive high-interest debt. The reframe. Debt is a tool. Like a knife. You can use a knife to prepare food or to harm yourself. The knife isn't inherently good or bad. Your use of it determines the outcome. Same with debt. Barrier 2. Being debt-free feels psychologically safe and accomplished. There's a real emotional payoff to saying, I don't owe anyone anything. It feels like freedom. It feels like security. And for people with history of destructive debt, achieving debt-free status is a major psychological victory. But this feeling, while valid, can be costly. If being debt-free means you have no mortgage and $300,000 in home equity but only $100,000 in liquid investments, you're not as secure as you feel. You're illiquid. If you had a $200,000 mortgage and $500,000 in liquid investments, you'd be objectively more secure, even though you'd have debt. The reframe. Security comes from liquidity and total net worth, not from being debt-free. A high net worth with strategic leverage is more secure than a modest net worth with no debt. Barrier 3. The borrower is slave to the lender. This biblical phrase and variations of it get repeated constantly in personal finance circles. And it captures a real truth about destructive debt. If you're over-leveraged, if you're drowning in payments, you are constrained. You're not free. But with strategic debt at reasonable levels, the opposite is true. By keeping capital liquid and invested instead of locked in home equity or used to pay off low-interest debt, you have more options, not fewer. More freedom, not less. The reframe. Strategic leverage increases optionality. Destructive leverage decreases it. Know the difference. Barrier 4. Risk aversion and loss aversion. Humans are wired to feel the pain of losses more intensely than the pleasure of equivalent gains. Psychologically, losing $10,000 feels worse than gaining $10,000 feels good. This asymmetry makes people avoid risk even when expected value is positive. With debt arbitrage, there's a risk that the market underperforms, that the spread doesn't materialize as expected, that you end up worse off than if you'd paid off debt. That possibility, even if unlikely, triggers loss aversion. The reframe. Zoom out to long-time horizons. Over 30 years, the probability of stock market returns exceeding 4% mortgage interest is very high historically. Yes, there's risk, but it's manageable risk with positive expected value. And the risk of not leveraging strategically is also real. You'll build less wealth, you'll work longer, you'll have less financial security. That's a guaranteed bad outcome in exchange for avoiding a probable good outcome. Let me show you how wealthy people and institutions actually think about this with a concrete example. When BlackRock issues corporate bonds, we're taking on debt. We borrow money from bond investors at, say, 4% interest. Why? Because we can deploy that capital in ways that generate more than 4% return. We invest it in growing the business, in technology, in acquisitions that increase revenue and profit. Is that risky? Of course. We could mismanage the capital. The investments could underperform. But we've determined that the expected return exceeds the cost of debt by enough to justify the risk. And by using debt instead of just retained earnings, we can grow faster, generate more value for shareholders, and build a larger, more successful company. Now, a financial advisor could look at BlackRock and say, "You have billions in debt. You should pay that off. Being debt-free would be safer." And we'd say, "That's nonsense. Our debt is strategic. It's low cost. We're using it to fund growth that returns far more than the interest rate. Paying it off would be destroying value." The same logic applies to individual wealth building. If you have a 3.5% mortgage and you have capital, paying off the mortgage is like BlackRock paying off low-cost corporate debt instead of using it to fund high-return investments. It feels safe, but it's actually destroying value. But individuals get advice that institutions would never follow. Pay off all debt. Be debt-free. Avoid leverage. No successful institution operates that way. And you shouldn't either if you want to build wealth efficiently. Let me give you one more angle. The opportunity cost of avoiding strategic debt. Let's say you're 30 years old. You have $50,000. You're buying a house. If you put down $50,000, you have no debt on that piece of the house, you have equity. If you put down $20,000 and invest $30,000, you have more debt but also an investment. Over 30 years, if that $30,000 investment grows at 9%, it becomes about $400,000. The extra interest you paid on the larger mortgage is maybe $30,000 to $40,000. Net benefit, $360,000 to $370,000. That's the opportunity cost of avoiding strategic debt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars that could have been yours, given to the bank unnecessarily because you wanted to minimize debt rather than maximize wealth. Now, again, if the stress of the extra debt isn't worth $360,000 to you, fine. Make that choice consciously. But most people make it unconsciously. They don't run the numbers. They just follow conventional wisdom about avoiding debt and never realize what it's costing them. At BlackRock, we quantify everything. We know what leverage costs. We know what it generates. We make informed decisions. You should do the same. Run the actual numbers for your situation. Compare the cost of debt to expected investment returns. Factor in your risk tolerance. Then make a decision based on analysis, not on fear or conventional wisdom. Let me close this section with the most important insight. Debt isn't the enemy of wealth building. Destructive debt is. But strategic debt, used correctly, is one of the most powerful tools for accelerating wealth accumulation. The wealthy understand this. Institutions understand this. But individuals are given advice that contradicts this. Advice that tells them to avoid all debt, to be debt-free, to pay off even low-interest debt as fast as possible. That advice keeps people poor. Not literally poor, but poor relative to what they could achieve if they thought strategically about leverage. It costs people hundreds of thousands or millions in foregone wealth. And it's based on emotional aversion to debt rather than rational analysis of costs, returns, and risks. You can follow that advice, or you can think like an institution thinks. Run the numbers, manage the risk appropriately, and use strategic debt to build wealth faster. Let's talk about how to implement this safely and effectively. Let me give you the complete implementation framework for using debt strategically. Because understanding the theory isn't enough. You need a systematic process for evaluating debt decisions and managing leverage safely. Mental model number 1. Debt is cheap capital. Capital is expensive. Use cheap capital to acquire expensive capital. This is the fundamental insight. When you borrow at 4% and invest at 10%, you're using cheap capital, debt, to acquire expensive capital, equity investments. The spread is your profit. The larger the spread and the longer the time horizon, the more wealth you build. Most people think backwards. They think debt is expensive and they should use their own money, which feels free. But your own money isn't free. It has an opportunity cost. If you use $100,000 of your money to pay off a 4% mortgage instead of investing it at 10%, you're giving up 6% returns annually. That's expensive, much more expensive than the debt. This reframe is critical. Debt at low rates is cheap capital. Your own capital deployed suboptimally is expensive. Use the cheap capital and preserve the expensive capital for high return uses. Mental model number 2. Optimize for total net worth, not for debt minimization. Your goal is to maximize net worth over your lifetime. Net worth equals assets minus liabilities. You can increase net worth by reducing liabilities, paying off debt. Or you can increase net worth by increasing assets, building investments. Or both. The question is, which strategy maximizes net worth faster? And the math is clear. For low-interest debt, paying it off slowly while investing aggressively maximizes net worth faster than paying it off quickly. But most people optimize for the wrong thing. They optimize for debt minimization. They want to see liabilities at zero. They feel accomplished when debt is gone. But they're not maximizing net worth. They're maximizing a feel-good metric that doesn't correlate with actual wealth. At BlackRock, we optimize for returns, for growth, for value creation. We never optimize for being debt-free. Debt-free isn't the goal. Maximum value creation is the goal. Individuals should think the same way. Mental model number 3. Time horizon determines strategy. If you have 30 years until retirement, debt arbitrage is powerful. The spread compounds for decades. Market volatility averages out. You build substantially more wealth. If you have 5 years until retirement, debt arbitrage is risky. You don't have time to recover from market downturns. The spread doesn't compound enough to overcome the risk. Your debt strategy must match your time horizon. Long time horizon equals more leverage, more arbitrage, more risk-taking. Short time horizon equals less leverage, more caution, more focus on guaranteed income. Mental model number 4. Liquidity is more valuable than equity. Equity in your house doesn't help you if you lose your job. It's locked up. You can't access it without selling or borrowing against it. Liquidity, cash and investments you can easily access. That's what provides security during emergencies. This is why carrying a moderate mortgage and having substantial liquid investments is safer than having no mortgage and minimal investments. The liquidity provides a buffer. The paid-off house provides a sense of security but not actual financial flexibility. Institutions understand this. They maintain liquidity even if it means carrying debt. Individuals should too. Mental model number 5. Manage leverage with rules, not emotions. Emotions around debt are powerful. Fear, shame, pride, anxiety. These emotions will push you to make suboptimal decisions. You need rules that override emotions. Rule. Debt service never exceeds 30% of gross income. Rule. Liquid assets always exceed 24 months of debt payments. Rule. Never borrow at rates above 8%. Rule. All leverage must have positive expected spread over long horizons. These rules keep you safe even when emotions are pushing you toward either excessive leverage or excessive aversion. Now let me give you the step-by-step implementation protocol. Step 1. Audit your current debt. List every debt, the interest rate, the monthly payment, the remaining balance. Categorize each as strategic, borderline, or destructive based on interest rate. Strategic. Below 6%, long-term, used to finance appreciating or productive assets. Keep these. Make minimum payments. Invest alternative capital. Borderline. 6% to 10%, short-term, used for necessary but depreciating assets. Evaluate case by case. Consider paying off if the spread to investment returns is small. Destructive. Above 10%, any term, used for consumption. Emergency. Pay off immediately even if it means selling investments or cutting consumption dramatically. Step 2. Calculate your debt service ratio. Add up all monthly debt payments. Divide by monthly gross income. If it's over 35%, you're over-leveraged. You need to either increase income, reduce debt, or both. If it's under 20%, you have room for strategic leverage if opportunities arise. Step 3. Assess your liquidity. Calculate months of expenses covered by liquid assets, cash, money market, taxable investments. If it's under 6 months, build liquidity before taking on more debt. If it's over 12 months, you have a strong buffer for managing leverage risk. Step 4. For each strategic debt, calculate the arbitrage opportunity. Interest rate on debt versus expected return on investments. If the spread is 4% or more and you have a 20-plus year time horizon, keep the debt and invest. If the spread is less than 3%, consider paying it off. If the spread is negative, definitely pay it off. Step 5. Implement automatic investing. If you're keeping strategic debt, you must be investing the alternative capital. Set up automatic monthly investments. The amount should equal what you would have paid extra on debt if you were paying it off aggressively. This is critical. The strategy only works if you actually invest the difference. If you keep strategic debt but spend the alternative capital on consumption, you're just carrying debt for no benefit. Step 6. Review annually and adjust. Interest rates change. Investment returns vary. Your risk tolerance evolves. Life circumstances shift. Once per year, revisit your debt strategy. Are the spreads still positive? Is your leverage ratio still comfortable? Do you need to adjust? At BlackRock, we review leverage and risk management quarterly for clients. You should do at least annually for yourself. Leverage is powerful but requires active management. Now let me address the most common objections I hear when I talk about strategic debt. Objection 1. What if the market crashes right after I invest instead of paying off debt? Response. If you have a 20-plus year time horizon, market crashes are temporary setbacks, not permanent losses. Every major market crash in history has been followed by recovery and new highs. If you're investing for decades, you'll experience multiple crashes and multiple recoveries. The long-term trajectory is what matters, not the short-term volatility. And critically, if the market crashes, you still have the investments, even if they're temporarily down. If you'd paid off debt instead, you'd have equity in your house but no liquid assets. Which position is better during a crisis? Liquid assets that can be accessed versus home equity that can't? I'd argue liquid assets, even down 30%, are more useful than inaccessible home equity. Objection 2. Isn't paying off debt a guaranteed return while investing is risky? Response. Yes. Paying off 4% debt gives you a guaranteed 4% return. But a guaranteed 4% return is not attractive when you can get expected 9% to 10% returns from diversified investments over long periods. The higher expected return compensates for the risk if your time horizon is sufficient. And remember, risk isn't binary. It's not risk versus safety. It's understanding probabilities and expected values. Historically, stocks have outperformed 4% about 85% to 90% of the time over 20-year periods. That's not guaranteed, but it's highly probable. And you're not betting everything on one outcome. You're systematically building a diversified portfolio over time. Objection 3. I just can't stand having debt. The psychological burden isn't worth it. Response. That's valid. If debt causes you severe stress that affects your quality of life, pay it off even if the math says otherwise. Mental health has value, but be honest about the cost. You're choosing psychological comfort over hundreds of thousands or millions in additional wealth. Make that choice consciously, not by default. And consider whether your stress about debt is rational or conditioned. Many people are stressed about 4% mortgages simply because they've been told debt is bad, not because they've actually calculated the risk. Educating yourself about strategic leverage might reduce that stress and allow you to benefit from the arbitrage. Objection 4. This sounds like advice that works only for wealthy people. I'm not wealthy. I can't afford to take these risks. Response. Actually, strategic debt arbitrage is more valuable for people building wealth than for people who already have wealth. If you already have $10 million, the difference between using leverage and not using leverage matters less. You're already financially secure either way. But if you have $100,000 in net worth and you're trying to reach $2 million for retirement, strategic leverage can cut years or decades off that timeline. By borrowing at 4% and investing at 10%, you're accelerating wealth accumulation dramatically. That's most valuable precisely when you're not yet wealthy. The key is managing risk appropriately. Keep leverage moderate. Maintain high liquidity. Don't overextend. But don't avoid leverage entirely just because you're not wealthy. That ensures you'll stay not wealthy longer. Objection 5. What if I lose my job and can't make the debt payments? Response. This is a legitimate risk, which is why liquidity is critical. If you're carrying strategic debt, you should also have 12 to 24 months of expenses in liquid investments. If you lose your job, you tap that liquidity to cover debt payments while you find new employment. Compare this to having no debt but also no liquidity. You lose your job, you have no income, no buffer, no way to cover expenses. Within months you're in crisis. Having strategic debt with high liquidity is actually safer than having no debt with no liquidity, even though it feels riskier emotionally. The real risk isn't the debt. It's being illiquid. Manage liquidity and the debt becomes manageable risk. Let me tell you about someone who executed this strategy perfectly. Started with $60,000 in student loans at 4.2%, $85,000 starting salary at age 25. Made minimum payments on the loans, about $625 per month. Invested everything else aggressively, about $2,000 per month initially, increasing to $4,000 per month by age 35. At age 40, they had $850,000 in investments and $12,000 remaining on the student loans, paid off on schedule. If they'd paid off the loans in 4 years and then started investing, they'd have about $420,000 at age 40. By using strategic debt, they doubled their net worth. And critically, they always maintained high liquidity. At age 35, they had $450,000 in investments. If they'd lost their job, they could have covered student loan payments for years from investment liquidation if necessary. They were never in a vulnerable position. That's strategic leverage done right. Moderate debt, low interest rate, aggressive investing of alternative capital, consistent execution over 15 years. The result, exceptional wealth building. Now let me be very clear about something. This strategy is not for everyone. If you can't control spending, if you can't commit to investing the alternative capital, if you can't tolerate any psychological stress around debt, this isn't for you. Pay off debt aggressively and build wealth more slowly through pure savings. But if you can manage money responsibly, if you can commit to systematic investing, if you can think rationally about risk and return, strategic debt is one of the most powerful wealth-building tools available. At BlackRock, we've been using leverage for nearly 40 years to build value for clients. We've survived multiple recessions, multiple market crashes, multiple cycles. And our use of strategic leverage, always risk-managed, always purposeful, has been a major contributor to our success. Individual investors can do the same on a personal level. Use low-cost debt strategically. Invest the alternative capital aggressively. Manage liquidity carefully. Review and adjust regularly. Over decades, this strategy builds substantially more wealth than avoiding all debt. The wealthy do this instinctively. They borrow at low rates to invest at high rates. They understand that leverage, used correctly, amplifies returns. They're not afraid of debt. They're afraid of missing opportunities to deploy capital efficiently. You should think the same way. Not recklessly, not over-leveraging, but not avoiding low-cost debt out of fear or conventional wisdom either. If this conversation changed how you think about debt, if you're seeing that strategic leverage is different from destructive debt, if you're realizing that you might have been following advice that costs you wealth, share this video. Send it to someone who's rushing to pay off a 3.5% mortgage when they could be investing at 9%. Send it to someone who needs to hear that the wealthy use debt to get wealthier, not avoid it. And join this community. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because we're going to keep having these conversations that challenge conventional financial wisdom and show you how institutions and wealthy individuals actually think about money, leverage, and wealth building. The difference between people who build significant wealth and people who stay middle class isn't usually income. It's not usually investment selection. It's understanding how to use tools like leverage strategically instead of avoiding them out of fear. Debt is a tool. Learn to use it, not destructively, not recklessly, but strategically, mathematically, purposefully. Because the spread between borrowing at 4% and investing at 10%, that spread compounds over decades into millions of dollars. That's wealth you're entitled to if you're willing to think differently than conventional wisdom tells you to think. If you're willing to run the actual numbers instead of following emotional rules about debt being evil. I've spent 50 years watching people build wealth and watching people miss opportunities. And one of the biggest opportunities people miss is the arbitrage between low-cost debt and high-return investments. Don't miss it. Use strategic debt. Invest aggressively. Manage risk appropriately. And watch your net worth grow faster than it would if you followed conventional advice about being debt-free. Your future self will thank you. Not for being debt-free. For being wealthy. There's a difference. And that difference is worth millions. Now go leverage cheap capital to acquire expensive capital. That's how wealth is really built.